Good morning. It's Monday afternoon. Well, sorry, it's Monday morning here in Gig Harbor. And I was just thinking about the fact that um, people watch these all times of the day. But that said, it is Monday morning in Gig Harbor, and we're talking about nutrition for cardiometabolic conditions this morning. It's the second in our series on cardiometabolic health. We meet Monday mornings, 11 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. If you want to watch live, there are three more in this series that'll be taking place on the next couple of Mondays. And today, this is actually part one of the two parts on nutrition for cardiometabolic health. And today we're going to function upon specific characteristics of our food that play a role in how we provide nutrition in the setting of cardiometabolic health. So food is interesting because it's a lot more of a complex topic than we may think. We think about food as bringing us calories and bringing us energy, and it certainly does that. So there is the caloric value of our food, and at the most basic levels, if there are not enough calories or if there are an excess of calories in our diet, then there's a basic mismatch. Beyond that, however, is the next level of what food is and or what food can bring to us, and that is what the quality of the food. So is it the macronutrients, the first portion of looking at food? Is it a fat? Is it a carbohydrate? Is it a protein? And very seldom do any of our foods come as just one category. They're typically, they fall into multiple categories. And breaking it down a little bit further, you then get into an issue of the quality of those categories. We're all aware that they're good and bad fats, they're good and bad carbohydrates, and they're good and bad proteins. And we're going to break those out. Then part of the quality discussion of food is the vitamin potential and the mineral potential and the trace element potential of our foods. And then the next level down about quality is also to start thinking about food as information. Those phytonutrients or compounds in food that connote messages, that affect physiology, that turn on and turn off genes based upon the message that we associate with that food. So we've got that component. And then we come down to food as medicine because Hippocrates said it, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. In many ways, we can specifically change things and change our physiologies to address conditions that we have, physiologic imbalances, or even directly affecting diseases in terms of what we include in our diet and what we don't include in our diet. And then the final component of food is food in all of its social and psychological components for how it affects us because of what we've learned about it. So let's break these apart one at a time, starting from the top to the bottom and as it applies to health in general, but specifically to cardiometabolic health. So starting out at the caloric level, basically, the second rule of thermodynamics says energy in equals energy out, basically. There's a conservation of energy. So if we consume a certain amount of energy, we're going to burn or store that same amount of energy. And the kind of conclusion that's been drawn from that is that generally when we eat a calorie, it is going to have a certain impact upon our body regardless. If we aren't burning, then the presumption is that if we're not burning a calorie, we're going to store that calorie, and that calorie is going to be stored as fat. And the presumption is that 3,500 extra calories should lead to a pound of stored fat a week. And the presumption, or in a day or whatever, 3,500 calories is 1 pound of fat. And the presumption is that if you have a deficit of 3,500 calories, you will lose a pound. And it is a lot more complex than that, because one of the things we've realized is that there are things that affect our basal metabolic rate. So, if my basal metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy I burn just to maintain sitting here in a chair, just to maintain keeping my brain running, keeping my heart running, keeping my bowels running, maintaining my body temperature, in all of that setting, then I presumptively would, if I increased my caloric intake, I would theoretically gain a pound if I had 3,500, or if I decreased my caloric intake, I would be a pound down because of the 3,500 calories less consumed. Now, what gets really complicated here is that we can affect that basal metabolic rate. We can affect it very dramatically by exercising, because if we exercise, we're going to increase our energy expenditure. But we can also impact that basal metabolic rate by changing our response in terms of just affecting that rate. Like if we deem that yesterday was a bad day, if we felt there wasn't good enough shelter, if we were cold, if there wasn't enough food, we will lower our metabolic rate. We will become a little insulin resistant, and we will store even if the caloric intake is less. Because what we'll do is we'll cheat from somewhere else. Like we'll either lower the metabolic rate so we don't have to burn as many calories. If our presumption was that we wanted to lose a pound in a week and we were going to cut back by 3,500 calories, which is 500 calories a day, and our basal metabolic rate was 1,900, and we cut out 500 calories, well, that should give us a pound. But if we drop that basal metabolic rate down to 1,700 or 1,600, because our bodies have defenses against losing weight. We want to protect ourselves against famine. For most of human history, famine's been an issue, not overeating. But so if we sit there and say, okay, here we are, the famine finally got here. It's taking 50 years to get here, but the famine got here. We'll lower our basal metabolic rate so that we don't lose the resources that we want to have in case tomorrow or today is as bad as what yesterday was. So it's not a simple equation of decreasing by 500 or increasing by 500 if we want to get to our caloric targets. We have to think about the things that make it a good day or a bad day. And a lot of that is based upon how we judge our interaction with the environment. Did we get enough sunlight? Is our vitamin D level up? Were we active? It's interesting that when we're active and the osteocytes in our bone are sensing the activity and the stress that our bone's been placed under. The osteocytes signal to the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts to either repair bone because we've had some stress, if we were like a weekend warrior, or if we went for a long hike, or if we put tension on that bone because muscle was working and we're building our muscle mass. And so we need a better structure to hold that muscle mass. We'll make new bone. And in making new bone, we make osteocalcin. And carboxylated osteocalcin is actually a message that goes to the beta cell of the pancreas and says, let's be more insulin sensitive. Let's make more energy available to, the muscle cell and store less because we're being active, and it is a great place to use that activity. So as we kind of push along, if we're active or if we're exercising, we're making ourselves more insulin sensitive. And it's a message that today's a good day. I think it's partly because our hunter-gatherer ancestors considered it a good day when they were out being able to walk and hunt and gather. They knew that they were going to get energy, so they were able to be insulin sensitive. Other messages come from like the foods that we eat. The profile of foods that we eat in springtime, if we're eating seasonally, are different than the foods that come later in the year. The early lettuces and greens, the asparaguses, some of the early non-starchy vegetables which start appearing, they send messages and increasing vitamin D level as we get more sunlight because we're outside and the day's gotten longer and we expose more skin. All of those pieces, they tell us that we can burn more energy because we're going to be getting more energy. Late in the year, when the root vegetables and the fruits and some of the big gourd vegetables, the starchier squashes, for example, start appearing, then the picture starts changing a little bit. The vegetables have different messages. The vitamin D levels are perhaps beginning to drop a little bit. We get different messages from the sunlight in terms of the day length, and we start storing up to hunker down for the winter. So the right messages play a role in how we hold a calorie. Similarly, when we're inflamed, when we're doing things that drive inflammation, that's one of those alarm messages which contributes to that degree of not being insulin sensitive, but instead being insulin resistant. And in being insulin resistant makes it so that we store energy as opposed to burning it because we are worried that tomorrow's going to be not a good day. So classically, we have to look at things that drive the picture. You can have someone who, for all the world, looks like they're not absorbing their food very well, having bad irritable bowel syndrome. You can see undigested food in their stool, and yet they seem not to be losing weight. It's not because they're not losing food and not losing calories from undigested food, but they're not losing weight because the body may be very inflamed and it's retaining water and it's retaining fat while it's losing muscle mass, and it's not burning calories for energy. So it's all a picture to look at. At the macronutrient level, there are good and bad carbohydrates, good and bad fats, and good and bad proteins. Proteins are one that we don't talk about a lot, and it's worthy to note that what I mean by good and bad proteins are whether or not they're a complete protein. If a protein is lacking in branched-chain amino acids like lysine and leucine and isoleucine and valine, If it's lacking in the branch-chain amino acids, you do not have a complete protein. And an incomplete protein is not as good at building new muscle mass. So, that's one of the challenges when we eat certain vegetarian sources, which is one of the reasons why when we're trying to be a complete vegetarian, when we're a vegan, we pair beans and rice together so that we fill in those gaps and we get a complete protein. But for example, if you are simply getting pea and rice protein in a protein shake, you may not be getting a complete protein. What you'll find is companies that really pay attention to this will actually add branch-chain amino acids as individual amino acids to the mix, but you need to be cognizant of the fact that because of the FDA rules, added amino acids can't go for the total protein content. So you may find a shake that says it's 17 grams of protein, but they've added 3 grams of amino acids. And you'd like to think that that's 20 grams, and it is because it's 20 grams of a complete protein. But the FDA, because only 17 is coming primarily from food sources like the pea and rice protein, are going to call that 17 grams. But you want to look for, look down at the food label and see how much branch-chain amino acids they add. The more complete proteins, the better ability to make muscle. Similarly, good and bad fats. We all have heard for a long time about the discussion that saturated fats are bad for us. Saturated fats being a chain, a carbon chain, where each carbon is bound to either another carbon with a single bond or to hydrogens. And it's saturated because there are no double bonds between the carbons. And so no gaps in terms of those side chains for the hydrogens. At the simplest of levels, saturated fats are more solid, less flexible, and have the potential, or were believed to have the potential, for being more associated with atherosclerosis. But the picture isn't as easy as we thought, because some saturated fats, like medium chain triglycerides, are beneficial for driving ketosis and for driving support of neurologic function. And a lot comes down to what the source is. Like butter, which is relatively high in saturated fat, is a lot more acceptable if it's grass-fed cattle producing the butter than if it's corn-fed cattle producing the butter. Because if it's grass-fed, there are going to be some omega-3 polyunsaturated fats there as well, which are good for us, as opposed to if it's corn-fed, there's going to be more omega-6, which have the potential for being pro-inflammatory fatty acids present. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors probably had a diet that included a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, so pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory of 3 to 4 to 1. If we're doing a good job of kind of eating the food pyramid sort of food plan, we're probably more like 10 to 20 to 1 for omega-6 to omega-3. And if we're eating the standard American diet, we could be up to 20 to 30 to 1 for omega-6 to omega-3. So we want to eat dietary sources that bring us lots of omega-3s, and we get omega-3s from the grasses and from algae and from animals that eat those sorts of things, as opposed to from corn, for example, which is high in omega-6. So, the kind of traditionally valued corn-fed beef, it may taste more mild because the omega-6s do taste more mild than that gamey omega-3 flavor, which you can get in free-range chickens, which you can get in wild game. The omega-6 leads to that marbling. It leads to a milder taste, but it's nowhere near as healthy for us. And finally, when you're talking about carbohydrates, one of the measures of good and bad carbohydrates is how rapidly they impact blood sugar. Glycemic index is a measure of how fast a sugar that's a constituent of a certain carbohydrate raises the food. So what's done 100 grams of that specific form of carbohydrate, like the carbohydrate that could be in carrot or in watermelon or in white bread or just in table sugar itself, you take 100 grams of it and you compare it to the 100 grams, for example, of table sugar, or compare it to 100 grams of white bread, depending which scale you're using. And you look to see how fast the impact is. The higher the glycemic index, the more it's going to drive the sugar up in a fast way. And the reason why we don't like that is a spiking sugar leads to a spiking insulin level, so higher insulin levels. And if you ate a meal that was just jelly beans, for example, simple sugar, tastes great, and I love jelly beans, I'm not knocking jelly beans, but if you ate just those, your sugar would spike, you'd have an availability of energy, you'd have a high insulin level, you'd have a tendency to try to store some of that sugar during the time it was available to you, particularly because your insulin levels were high, and you'd be talking to your fat cells as well as your muscle cells, and you wouldn't have the ability for the stomach to slowly metabolize and digest and provide you energy. If you had a rapidly absorbable simple sugar carbohydrate, if you also had some more complex carbohydrates slower, if you had some proteins even slower and fats even slower, and you can lead to stability of your blood sugar as you convert all of that to energy that you can use. So that's why we look for mixed meals. But certain carbohydrates that we call complex, like white bread, still has a very high glycemic load. White potatoes have a very high glycemic load. So it's important to measure. Now, you've probably heard about the difference, and I just used the term glycemic load versus glycemic index. And that is important because glycemic index is 100 grams compared to 100 grams. But a lot of foods don't have 100 grams in them. For example, carrots have a relatively high glycemic index. The carbohydrate that's available in carrots is easily metabolized, so it's going to lead to a spike. But the reality of it is versus eating a piece of white bread, and not even one piece of white bread is basically 100 grams, but eating that piece of white bread, you'd have to eat like a bunch of carrots. And when I say a bunch, like 8, 9, 10 carrots all tied together in a bunch. That's a bunch of carrots. So eating all of those carrots, you get a lot of fiber and you get a lot of those carotenoids, the orange, the yellows, the reds that are there in the carrot making an orange appearance. So you've got phytonutrients, you've got vitamin potential from the carotenoids, you've got all that fiber, you've got flavor, you've got all these messages. And because no one really eats an entire bunch of carrots, the glycemic load is less than the glycemic load for that piece of bread. It's basically an adjustment for serving size. Like watermelon tastes really sweet, but because there's so much fiber and there's so much water present, it has a relatively low glycemic load. So that's just a broad discussion looking at macronutrients, looking at the vitamins that are present in our food, looking at the other components, in terms of elements and minerals. We sometimes add, like we take out some of the folic acid when we've made white bread, for example, as opposed to whole wheat. And we have chosen to supplement flour with folic acid, but it's not the naturally occurring folate, which is the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, which some of us require, which is more available to us in the green leafy vegetables, for example, than the folic acid that's in bread. So we have to make our choices. Eating a broad range of foods, eating a broad color of foods, bring us the vitamins, bring us the nutrients. When it comes to something as simple as selenium, for example, a Brazil nut or two a day is sufficient to provide us enough selenium. And yet 50% of Americans are selenium deficient. 50% of us are zinc deficient. Lots of us are vitamin D deficient. It's because we don't eat a broad range of foods. The average American probably eats fewer than 7 to 10 different fruits and vegetables during the course of the year. And when this sort of statistic is included, that's not like carrots versus apples. It's also including like red delicious versus golden delicious apples, or versus a Macintosh, all as different ones. Actually, if you ate all three, that would be 3 in this category count. We don't have very much diversity. Indeed, a statistic that's now a few years old, I heard Alton Brown quote that the average American eats less than 100 different foods in a year. And, that's not just like eating mustard, but yellow mustard and brown mustard would be 2 different things. We eat the same things over and over again, which leaves us lots of rooms for gaps. Eating, as Dr. Minnick, Deanna Minnick has talked about, a rainbow diet, eating all the colors of our food provides us the opportunity to fill in those gaps. And it becomes really important. We've talked about from a kind of food be thy medicine perspective. We've talked about, the benefits of omega-3 fatty acids being anti-inflammatory. But, like when you look at omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DHA, and go back to what we were talking about last week and thinking about particle size and particle number, omega-3 fatty acids increase particle size, LDL particle size. So they'll make the particles bigger, which is what we want, and reduce overall the total number of particles. It doesn't change LDL-C. So, people will say, oh, omega-3 fatty acids don't change your LDL cholesterol. But what they do is they change the amounts of the small dense particles, and they reduce the overall number of particles, and they improve particle size. Another place where omega-3 fatty acids have a role is DHA. EPA is converted to DHA, and DHA is the one that's most important for brain and for heart. But interestingly, DHA binds to a receptor, a taste bud receptor, in our guts. And when it binds to the taste bud receptor in our guts, it stimulates G-coupled protein receptor 120. And when it does that, it increases the production of GLP-1, which is glucagon-like peptide 1. And it actually stimulates the production of insulin. And so it stimulates the production of insulin when glucose is sensed by the cells. So it more appropriately times our insulin secretion to go along with our carbohydrates. We use GLP-1 agonist drugs to treat diabetes. Omega-3 fatty acids, eating fish each day, would help with our insulin sensitivity. There are lots of examples. We work to have diets that support people in their health and in their health challenges on the way to optimal wellness here at the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Center by Metagenics in Gig Harbor. Call 253-853-7233 if you're interested in being a patient. Later today, Dr. Michael Stone and I will, Monday afternoons, 4 p.m., we'll be having our Monday afternoon coffee break. And we look forward to seeing you then, and we look forward to seeing you next Monday. All righty, take care, and thank you.